I have to thank you uh, not only for the opportunity and honor to give this lecture, um, but also for your friendship, which has been abiding through the many years since we first met at the Forum on Contemporary Theory many years ago. So I'm not going to waste too much time, except to say, make a couple of caveats before I get into the lecture. Um, the first is that I'm very sorry to have joined a little bit late. I actually joined early and then somehow uh, lost the connection and then had trouble getting back in. But here I am. Sorry for that inconvenience and delay. And apologies in advance for what will be a rather long lecture. I had originally written a somewhat shorter lecture and had pitched it to what I thought would be an undergraduate audience. But yesterday, upon enjoying Dr. Robbins' wonderful session and seeing that in fact this was a master's audience and faculty audience, as Thomas clarified, I revised my talk. And so I hope it will be suitable for the level of all of you. I realize that for some of you, it'll be a bit like Romanticism 101, for those of you very well versed in Romanticism. And for others, this may be newer terrain, but I hope it will stimulate some interesting questions that I'll be able to take at the end of the rather long lecture, which is just over an hour. And I will take a half an hour of questions regardless of when I finish. So I hope you can bear with me. Thank you in advance for your patience. How did we become modern? How we answer that question, what kind of story we tell of where we've ended up, actually lands us in different places. It informs not only our self-conception, but also our other conception and the sense of our horizon. Master narratives are the West's version of myths, overarching stories of how we became who we are. But who we are depends on how we tell the story. Postmodernism has debunked the notion of master narrative. Yet, however debunked, they continue to operate, albeit more implicitly, sometimes more consequentially because only implicit. My own sense is that master narratives will never go away. So it falls to us to identify them clearly and to counter them with better, i.e., more correct or more humane ones. Two historiographical modes of master narratives in the Western tradition are teleology and genealogy, teleology being the dominant mode of telling the story of modernity. Now, again, this may be very elementary for you, but it's worth the little reminder of definitions here, where teleology, of course, is a view of history as progressing towards an inevitable, ultimate, desirable endpoint, or telos. And genealogy, following Nietzsche, Foucault, Zizek, and many others, is an account of history that sees the paths that did not prevail as part of history and takes those failures to be contingent rather than necessary. These alternate paths of history provide the vantage from which to criticize the present/orthodoxy. As such, genealogy is both backward and forward-looking. In this talk, I'm going to set one master narrative that explains the massive transformation that is modernity against another, teleology versus genealogy. Let's start with a basic question. How did the West transform from a world in which religion was the sky above to one in which belief is merely an option? A beleaguered one at that, in many milieux, like our own academic one. And here, I'm not sure the extent to which I should extend the hour, because there are obvious differences between the Indian context and the North Atlantic one, but I will leave that to you to nuance. For religious belief to have become not only an option, but in some sense an embattled option, there had to have been a massive shift, quote, in the whole context of understanding, explicit and implicit, in which our moral, spiritual, or religious experience and search takes place. That's Charles Taylor, unquote. Tracing this shift in painstaking detail is the endeavor of philosopher Charles Taylor's 2007 paradigm-shifting 900-page study, A Secular Age. Both in content and mode, his account of the modern West diverges from the standard secularization thesis that explains the decline of religion as an inevitability of modernity. The secularization thesis is usually articulated as a subtraction story. the dominant teleological mode of presenting modernity as the, quote, underlying features of human nature which were there all along, but had been impeded by what is now set aside, unquote. Taylor instead tells a story of transformation, quote, against this type of narrative, i.e. the subtraction story, I will steadily be arguing that Western modernity, including its secularity, is the fruit of new inventions, newly constructed self-understandings and related practices, and can't be explained in terms of perennial features of human life, unquote. Like fellow philosopher Akhil Bilgrami, who extends Taylor's work and whom I shall treat next, Taylor studies the active constructions, in particular the ethical constructions of modernity, inaugurated ironically by religion itself, 300 years of reforms in the late Latin Church. The new ethical constructions of modernity, quote, changed both belief and unbelief, both religious and non-religious institutions, the way human beings understood both themselves and nature, unquote. These are the editors of the volume Varieties of Secularism in a Secular Age. The concentric ethical constructions that most interest Taylor, Bilgrami, myself, and a robust radical Enlightenment tradition, including the anti-colonial figures like Gandhi, whom I will mention later, are, as I see it, the immanent frame, exclusive humanism, and buffered selfhood. At some length, I will now define and dwell upon these three key terms. Immanent frame. So what exactly distinguishes the enchanted worldview from the disenchanted one? And how was the tremendous shift from the one context of understanding to the other unique to European modernity? To answer these questions, let us explore those nested constructions, immanent frame, exclusive humanism, and buffered selfhood, comprising the main background conditions that have rendered religion optional for the first time in the history of humanity. These radically altered conditions for belief/unbelief are what Taylor means by secularity. To reiterate, these conditions extend to believers and non-believers alike. Chief among them is the immanent frame, the social imaginary that posits a self-standing, impersonal, natural order. Enabled by deism and the subsequent rise of science, this social imaginary embraces everyone in the modern West, as evidenced by everyday language. The commonplace distinction between immanent and transcendent, between the natural and supernatural, would not have made sense 500 years ago. But now, this is Taylor, everyone understands these distinctions, both those who affirm and those who deny the second term of each pair. This hiving off of an independent, freestanding level, that of nature, which may or may not be in interaction with something further or beyond, is a crucial bit of modern theorizing, which in turn corresponds to a constitutive dimension of modern experience. The great invention of the West was that of an immanent order in nature, whose working could be systematically understood and explained on its own terms. This notion of the immanent involved denying, or at least isolating and problematizing, any form of interpenetration between the things of nature on one hand and the supernatural on the other, be this understood in terms of the one transcendent God, or of gods and spirits, or magic forces, or whatever. So defining religion in terms of the distinction immanent/transcendent is a move Taylor made for our culture, for which this distinction has become foundational. And again, by our, he's referring to Western Europe and North Atlantic. Unquote. That this, like the other key features of secularity, developed out of late Latin Christianity, deism, itself proves that the main stake of secularity is not the disappearance of religion, but the establishment of the doctrine of naturalism simpliciter, quote, an immanent order in nature whose working could be systematically understood and explained on its own terms, again, unquote. As the editors of Varieties of Secularism in a Secular Age remind us, quote, religion and spirituality are not extinguished in this context, but have rather been refigured. We should not confuse disenchantment with the end of religion, therefore, as religious commitments and openings to transcendence remain possible from within the immanent frame, even as new forces push for the closure of immanence. Here, the editors are referring to different orientations to quote unquote fullness, which another keyword of Taylor's, which he explains in this way. We all see our lives and or the space wherein we live our lives as having a certain moral/spiritual shape. Somewhere in some activity or conditions lies a fullness, a richness. That is, in that place, activity or condition, life is fuller, richer, deeper, more worthwhile, more admirable, more what it should be. This is perhaps a place of power. We often experience this as deeply moving, as inspiring. Perhaps this sense of fullness is something we just catch glimpses of from afar off. We have the powerful intuition of what fullness would be were we to be in that condition. But sometimes there will be moments of experienced fullness, of joy and fulfillment, where we feel ourselves there. We have moved from a world in which the place of fullness was understood as unproblematically outside of or beyond human life to a conflicted age in which this construal is challenged by others, which place in a wide range of different ways within human life. This is what a lot of the important fights have been about more recently, as against an earlier time when people fought to the death over different readings of the Christian construal, unquote. This is why, in the delimited context of the modern West, religion, a term nearly impossible to define in most contexts, can rather easily be understood in terms of the transcendent immanent distinction. For believers, fullness and objective reality, quote unquote, the way the world is, or at least can sometimes be, not merely a result of subjective attitude, unquote, those are the editors, entails the transcendental. So let me repeat that. For believers, fullness and objective reality entails the transcendental, quote, that which is beyond nature by virtue of the actual contemporary existence of some other or additional reality, unquote. Not so for believers who turn inward to human achievement, to the power of reason, to their own psychological depths, for example, as the locus of fullness. This is what is meant by the closure of immanence. When the background condition is an immanent frame that posits the natural, quote unquote, as a default category, sharply separated from the marked category supernatural, unquote, it is harder for believers to reach their place of fullness. Unlike believers in, quote, archaic societies where religion is everywhere, unquote, modern Western believers must withstand new forces pushing for the closure of immanence. Still, because of their continued opening to transcendence, believers may yet reach fullness. For others, it is harder, rarer. Quote, fullness is less available now than it used to be, when it seemed routinely the case that the material world was not all that there was, unquote. That's the editors. In short, for both believers and non-believers, the immanent frame, the new fundamental background condition, poses a great obstacle to fullness. Yet the consequences of the immanent frame and the metaphysics underwriting it, naturalism simpliciter, go far beyond posing obstacles to fullness or generating a nova effect regarding spiritual orientations. They have been vast, ranging from scientism in extremis to massive extractive economies and overseas ventures, i.e. colonialism. If Blake in his poetry makes the connection between the metaphysical doctrine and its political economic consequences, Bill Gramy in his philosophical essays does the same. I shall address the latter shortly. Actually, I'll address both. Okay, so the next key word, exclusive key phrase, I should say key term, is exclusive humanism. The fulcrum between the metaphysics of naturalism simpliciter and its political consequences is an ethics of exclusive humanism. Unlike anima mundi, a self-standing, dispirited, impersonal natural order that can be objectively studied, cannot place normative constraints on humans. Therefore, it becomes possible for humans to concern themselves with no higher/other flourishing beyond their own. Taylor puts it pithily, quote, one could offer this one-line description of the difference between earlier times and the secular age. A secular age is one in which the eclipse of all goals beyond human flourishing becomes conceivable. Or better, it falls within the range of an imaginable life for masses of people. This is the crucial link between secularity and a self-sufficing humanism. In a fuller elaboration, Taylor explains, I would like to claim that the coming of modern secularity, in my sense, has been coterminous with the rise of a society in which, for the first time in history, a purely self-sufficient humanism came to be a widely available option. I mean by this a humanism accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beyond this flourishing. Of no previous society was this true. Higher beings like gods or spirits, or a higher kind of being, like the ideas or the cosmopolis of gods and humans, demanded and deserved our worship, reverence, devotion, or love. In some cases, this reverence or devotion was itself seen as integral to human flourishing. It was a proper part of the human good. Taoism is an example, as are such ancient philosophies as Platonism and Stoicism. In other cases, the devotion was called for, even though it would be at our expense or conduce to our good only through winning the favor of a god. But even here, the reverence called for was real. These beings commanded our awe. There was no question of treating them as we treat the forces of nature we harness for energy. In this kind of case, we might speak of a humanism, but not a self-sufficing or exclusive humanism, which is the contrast case, which is at the heart of modern secularity, unquote. This distinction between mere humanism and exclusive humanism is crucial, particularly for anti-colonial contexts, which sought to cultivate a rich humanism that was always understood to be inclusive of non-human realms, i.e. nature and divinity. How and why, by contrast, did Europe, a still vigorously religious Europe, come to understand its humanism as exclusive of these realms? Ironically, religion itself, namely providential deism, quote, paved the way for exclusive humanism, even though its protagonists did not understand themselves as leaving the realm of religion, and indeed understood themselves as solving problems within existing Christianity. A secular perspective grew within religion before it was taken up by the irreligious, unquote, the editors. Those are Warner, by the way, those are Michael Warner, Craig Calhoun, and Jonathan Van Antwerpen. Over hundreds of years of reforms affecting both Catholics and Protestants, Western Christianity, by making itself more rigorous, ended up ironically making itself irrelevant. A handful of these reforms were especially significant in forging the secular age. First, the church attempted to cleanse itself of folk elements, particularly magic. We have already seen how demagicking the world was essential to developing the immanent frame and the doctrine of naturalism simpliciter. Furthermore, now exiled to a distant locus, safeguarded, i.e. Deus absconditus, from the audacious manipulations of magic-wielding mortals, God no longer intervened frequently in everyday life. The secular result of this was twofold. He was gradually forgotten, and an impersonal natural order, explicable by science, became thinkable. Another major reform had cascading consequences, a new morality of self-discipline for parishioners. A rigor that had previously been reserved for clergy had a triple secular effect. A, it made religion more personal and mental. This is what Taylor refers to as, quote, the great disembedding, unquote. He writes, the compromise between the individuated religion of devotion or obedience or rationally conceived virtue on one hand, and the collective, often cosmos-related rituals of whole societies on the other, was broken, and in favor of the former. Disenchantment, reform, and personal religion went together, unquote. To be religious had always meant being embedded in society and cosmos. Now religion became a much more individuated and circumscribed affair. This reform gave rise to, quote, a new self-understanding of social existence, one which gave an unprecedented primacy to the individual, unquote. As well, it turned its practitioners into disciplined, buffered selves, soon to become the locus of the secular age's ethical order, exclusive humanism. Not only did religion become more personal and mental, but the emphasis on the individual subject, combined with the split between body and mind, led to exclusive humanism's detached point of view on and instrumental relation to the world. B, the proliferation of rules mirrored politesse in the court. Civilizing became a central project. with, I would add, important results in the following centuries when that agenda extended overseas. C, it would become too onerous for some parishioners to meet this clerical standard of self-discipline. So the church saw attrition. Atheism became a genuine option for the first time. Finally, and most directly enabling exclusive humanism, deism's affirmation of ordinary life, happiness, hard work, family life, gradually eliminated the need for profound spiritual transformation, thus rendering superfluous the ritual/ancestral/higher time, with higher time replaced by secular time, and with ordinary life newly affirmed, exclusive humanism became possible, and with it, its collective goods. The market, the democratic public sphere, equality, and rights for increasing numbers of people. The value and indispensability of most of these collective goods are undeniable, but the question posed by people like Bilgrami and Gandhi is whether they might be achievable without sacrificing an enchanted worldview. In other words, is exclusive humanism necessary to achieve these goods? Okay, the final term, buffered selves. Though exclusive humanism is underwritten by an ethic of mutual benefit, its locus is nevertheless the autonomous, disembedded individual. Individuals form a polity for mutual benefit based on a moral order that emphasizes rights and obligations. It proves ethically significant that these individuals are buffered selves. A firm boundary separates mind and world. Thoughts and meanings are only in minds, quote unquote, and atomism and disengagement become serious possibilities. Taylor explains this uniquely modern phenomenon by contrasting it with the porous selves of earlier times. Quote, but in the enchanted world, meanings are not in the mind in this sense, certainly not in the human mind. If we look at the lives of ordinary people, and even to a large degree of elites 500 years ago, we can see in myriad ways how this was so. First, they lived in a world of spirits, both good and bad. These extra human agencies offer a picture of minds somewhat like ours, in which meanings in the form of benevolent or malevolent intent can reside. Moreover, forces here were not all agents or subjectivities who could decide to confer a favor, but power also resided in things. These objects were loci of spiritual power, which is why they had to be treated with care, and if abused, could wreak terrible damage. Indeed, we can say that in this world, there is a whole gamut of forces, ranging from, to take the evil side for a moment, super agents like Satan himself, forever plotting to encompass our damnation, down to minor demons like spirits of the woods, which are almost indistinguishable from the loci they inhabit, and ending in magic potions which bring sickness or death. This illustrates a point which I want to bring out, that the enchanted world, in contrast to our universe of buffered selves and minds, shows a perplexing absence of certain boundaries which seem to us essential, unquote. One cannot overestimate the significance of the buffered self in the development of secularity, i.e. the optionality of religion. So long as selves were porous, God was a necessary protection, and therefore spurning God was simply not an option. Quote, God figures in this world as the dominant spirit, and moreover, as the only thing that guarantees that in this awe-inspiring and frightening field of forces, good will triumph. The prospect of rejecting God does not involve retiring to the safe redoubt of the buffered self, but rather chancing ourselves in the field of forces without him, unquote. That was Taylor. But the implications of the buffered self exceed the removal of a large obstacle to unbelief. By shifting the locus of meaning entirely to human minds, the concept of the buffered self shifts the entire ethical terrain: agency, self-understanding, value, alienation, etc. How so? Quote, if thoughts and meanings are only in minds, then there can be no charged objects, and the causal relations between things cannot be in any way dependent on their meanings, which must be projected on them from our minds. In other words, the physical world outside the mind must proceed by causal laws which in no way turn on the moral meanings things have for us. By contrast, in the enchanted world, the meaning is already there in the object/agent. It is there quite independently of us. It would be there even if we didn't exist. And this means that the object/agent can communicate this meaning to us, impose it on us in a third way, by bringing us, as it were, into its field of force. It can, in this way, even impose quite alien meanings on us, ones that we would not normally have. Once meanings are not exclusively in the mind, once we can fall under the spell, enter the zone of power of exogenous meaning, then we think of meaning as including us, or perhaps penetrating us." Unquote. From this passage alone, one could deduce certain seminal implications to be pursued in fine detail by Belgrami, whose arguments I treat in the next section. The world no longer provides meaning, so it loses value and we become alienated from it. Our own sense of importance in and invulnerability to the world increases, and we become epistemocentric. There are gains, quote, "The fears, anxieties, even terrors that belong to the porous self are behind it. This sense of self-possession, of a secure inner mental realm, is all the stronger if, in addition to disenchanting the world, we have also taken the anthropocentric turn and no longer even drawn the power of God," unquote. Taylor. The human world relation becomes a zero-sum game. In order for us to have power, it must have none. Quote, "Objectification of the world gives a sense of power and control, which is intensified by every victory of instrumental reason," unquote. But there are also losses that go with buffered selfhood. Quote, "What you won't hear at other times and places is one of the commonplaces of our day, that our age suffers from a threatened loss of meaning. This malaise is specific to a buffered identity, whose very invulnerability opens it to the danger that not just evil spirits, cosmic forces, or gods won't get to it, but that nothing significant will stand out for it," unquote. These nested ethical constructions, immanent frame, exclusive humanism, buffered selfhood, comprise the main background conditions that have rendered religion optional for the first time in the history of humanity. These radically altered conditions for belief/unbelief are what Taylor means by secularity, his key word to be distinguished from the more common keywords in the discourse: secularism, i.e. the political ideology regarding public spaces, and secularization, the sociological process of declining religion. At the beginning of the secular age, official philosophers validated the modern ethical order. Now we have rhetorics of discipline to keep us in line with it. For example, pejorative references to magical thinking, or even to superstition. But why should we require such rigorous disciplines of rhetoric and thought if what has been revealed is the core of human nature, i.e. the subtraction story? Well, because of the threat of the alternative, its resurgence, its prospect, ever present since the inception of the Orthodox Enlightenment. Genealogy teaches us that it was historical contingency, not necessity, that gave us the particular version of modernity that we have in the West. If Taylor emphasizes reforms in the church, Belgrami emphasizes that the question of enchantment has been political ever since the Newtonian establishment, set against the scientific heterodoxy, asserted its disenchanted conception of nature. The heterodoxy's idea that divinity animates the world from within and permeates all that is contained in it distinguished the enchanted worldview from the disenchanted worldview, which posited a Deus absconditus, who from the outside gave the initial push and then left alone an otherwise brute material world. The 17th century scientific heterodoxy, continuous with the long-standing religious traditions, took matter to be, quote, "not brute and inert, but rather shot through with an inner source of dynamism that was itself divine. God and nature were not separable," unquote. As Belgrami explains, both views, passionately fought over in the 17th century English scientific community, were equally scientific/unscientific, but the disenchanted worldview prevailed over the enchanted worldview for purely political reasons, namely its alliances with the cognitive and mercantile elite, which had obvious stakes in the debate. The massive historical consequences of the Newtonian establishment's victory over the scientific heterodoxy can be felt all the way down to colonialism, the logical conclusion of a disenchanted worldview in which nature, like its primitive custodians, primitive custodians, was rendered brute and thus available for merciless extraction. Extraction that would not, as in primitive ritual, require any acts of atonement or sacrifice. Significantly, the scientific dissenters have analogs in heterodoxies as historically and culturally diverse as the English diggers, the levelers, the romantics, the thousand-year-old Bhakti tradition in India, and the anti-colonial movement as epitomized by Gandhianism. The enchanted worldview was the cornerstone of all these philosophies. It is Taylor's and Bilgrami's aim to draw attention to the contingency of the developments in the West, the specific reforms in the late Latin Church that culminated in providential deism, and the Newtonian orthodoxy's worldly alliances with the mercantile and cognitive elite of England in the late 17th century. Both philosophers exhort us to remember that the shape that modernity took in the West is the, quote, product of specific historical events, circumstances, and decisions that might have been otherwise. This gives a different inflection to Taylor's command to himself on our behalf to, quote, go back and tell the story properly, unquote. It becomes more radical when the revised story is told on behalf of a counter tradition sometimes referred to as the radical Enlightenment. This counter tradition would begin, a la Bilgrami, at the moment of Enlightenment's inception itself, would trace, a la Jonathan Israel, Spinoza's pantheism from deism through the French Revolution, and would include, a la Colin Yeager, Blake, Wordsworth, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and Bataille. In this revised story, these figures would not be seen merely as representatives of alternative reactions to the Enlightenment, but rather as joint participants in a radical intellectual tradition whose target is the official metaphysics of a mainstream consensus stretching from Locke and Newton forward to the official guardians of order, security, and the market in our own day. This counter tradition in all its variety is the one especially attuned to the costs, metaphysical, spiritual, psychological, of modernity, unquote. That was Colin Yeager. To this lineup, Bilgrami adds Marx and Gandhi. As a colonial, Gandhi was especially attuned to the costs of disenchanted European modernity. Furthermore, because India had 2 centuries hindsight unavailable to their European counterparts when the latter had been at a similar cusp, a similar metamorphosis, the Indians were uniquely in a position to avoid that path of disenchantment without sacrificing modernity tout court. I would now like to dwell on Romanticism, which, in its stance of counter-scientism and counter-alienation, is the main node in the long line of resistance. With its visionary orientation, its ethic of cognitive revolution impelling political revolution, and its prescriptive prerogative vis-a-vis reality, Romantic poetry set itself to re-enchanting the Western world. Romanticism provides the conceptual groundwork for re-enchantment writ large. By the time that the younger Romanticists were writing, disenchantment was well underway. But by Blake's time, it was still new enough that his trenchantly critical diagnosis of it is all the more impressive. It was he who first and so cogently connected Newtonianism to the broader cultural changes decried by the Romantics. He who most explicitly connected the metaphysics of natural supernaturalism to a politics of resistance and revolution. I agree with Bilgrami that Abrams is astute to single out natural supernaturalism as the cornerstone of Romanticism, a movement with several other unique attributes that Romanticists debate in terms of superlative distinction. In Blake's visions of the Daughters of Albion, Othune laments, quote, "They told me that the night and day were all that I could see. They told me that I had 5 senses to enclose me up, and they enclosed my infinite brain into a narrow circle," unquote. Who are they? Commentator Robert Essick assigns the pronoun to, quote, "the anonymous forces that convince humans of their finitude, a group that includes the rationalist believers in the doctrines of Bacon, Newton, and Locke," unquote. Blake, through Othune, cannily, quote, "attributes what we usually construe as natural limits to an ideological source, rationalist doctrine," unquote. Indeed, Europe's long since naturalized conceptions of the nature of reality were actively formed several hundred years ago by ideologues who set modernity on a particular, not an inevitable path. Blake's poem brings us back to this fork in modernity's road, the watershed moment that so preoccupies Belgrami and others, including myself. Essig notes that, quote, this section of visions has been largely overlooked by modern interpreters, probably because it delves into some rather obscure, he uses the word obscure, 18th century debates over the nature of the senses and does not speak directly to the issues of sex, slavery, and colonialism of central interest to modern commentators, unquote. These 18th century debates over the nature of the senses were, of course, merely extensions of the debate over the nature of nature in the Royal Society in the preceding century. The metaphysical doctrine of naturalism simpliciter comprehends both. And that doctrine was, from the outset, directly connected to the ideologies and institutions of Western modernity, as Belgrami has argued. It is fruitful to ask, how is it that Blake himself keenly perceived this connection, whereas his modern interpreters do not? Perhaps this enigma can be explained by teleology obscuring genealogy. Built into the very ideology of Orthodox modernity is the notion that it inevitably had to have taken the shape it took. Such naturalization of a non-inevitability over hundreds of years leads us to forget modernity's sources in debates that theoretically could have been won by the other side. Essig's adjective obscure to describe these early debates is a telling choice. Indeed, modernity's subtraction story, enhanced by the passage of time, has obscured a heterodox epistemology that needs to be brought into the light if we are to understand the making of our particular version of modernity and the possibilities for unmaking it, the project of all counter-Enlightenment protagonists. Standing on the shoulders of giants, I hope to restore a lively sense of the turning point in modernity, one that bears on not only the trajectory of Europe, but also that of its colonies. Blake's visions of the Daughters of Albion shuttles us back to a time when these debates were still relatively recent, when romantics believed that the doctrine of naturalism simpliciter could yet be overturned by the metaphysics of natural supernaturalism, that a revolution of mind would bring about a revolution of politics, that poetry could midwife these tandem revolutions. Though this belief, dashed by the fallout of the French Revolution, was driven increasingly into the realms of the imaginative rather than the actual political, it was to resurface time and time again through the history of European poetry and philosophy/theory, albeit to different degrees and in vastly different modes, as different even as Romantic and modernist poetry. So what exactly is natural supernaturalism? Why is it so important as to be deemed a centerpiece of the long Romantic period? And how does it relate not only to the aforementioned politics, but also to other dimensions of modernity? Belgrami disambiguates the seemingly paradoxical term natural supernaturalism, coined by Carlyle in Sartor Resartus and borrowed by M.H. Abrams for the title of his landmark study of Romanticism. Belgrami lays out a triple distinction between natural and supernatural that derives from his incisive reading of Abrams. In the first distinction between the natural and the supernatural, natural means that which is not religious/sacral, and supernatural designates that which is religious/sacral. In the second distinction, the natural is immanent, perceptible, and phenomenal, whereas the supernatural is transcendental, imperceptible, and noumenal. The non-coincidence of these two distinctions is precisely what produces possibilities we call natural supernatural, such as pantheism. Natural supernatural phenomena would be considered natural by the one definition, yet supernatural by the other. Hence the paradoxical term natural supernaturalism. To take our example of pantheism, the revered spirit would be considered supernatural by the first definition, because sacral, yet natural by the second, because immanent. To these two natural/supernatural distinctions explicit in Abrams' book, Belgrami adds a crucial third on Abrams' behalf. In the third distinction, the natural means that which science studies, and therefore the natural must mean, and therefore the supernatural must mean all that science cannot study. This third distinction, which Abrams himself does not explicitly point out, emerges from the 17th century ambition to leave nothing natural out of the purview of science. This notion is still with us today. Implicitly, Bilgrami argues, Abrams' book provides ample exemplification of, quote, the idea, perhaps the most central idea in Romantic metaphysics, that not only the words on our pages and on our lips, and not only the images on our canvases, but objects and things in the world, including in nature, are filled with properties of value and meaning, unquote. This is an old idea, primarily explained in religious, including pagan vocabularies, but, quote, because this third distinction does not coincide with the first distinction, these properties of value and meaning that fall outside the coverage of science can inhere in what is immanent and perceptible without being elaborated in anything but secular terms, unquote. So, secular enchantment becomes a particular possibility in modernity, one cherished by the Romantics. Among other things, Bilgrami's triple disambiguation of natural supernaturalism shows that enchantment need not be religious in every instance. Science, including sociology, like the Comteanism that was so germane to figures like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, excludes much more than religion. Therefore, so let me read that again. Science excludes much more than religion. Therefore, enchantment includes much more than religion. What lies beyond the scope of science and Comte et al. Is part of the ethos of enchantment. Comte and the positivists had begun to think of nature as what science can study. Therefore, nature took on a new meaning with the positivists, and for Bilgrami, even earlier with the 17th century Newtonians. After that point, nature is not defined so much as the opposite of the transcendent as that which science studies. Therefore, enchanted nature, though necessarily immanent, comes to be thought of as supernatural, in that science does not study it. For the claim that nature contains values that science cannot study to have become controversial indicates the strength and reach of scientism, even by Blake's time. Bilgrami methodically elaborates on the importance of making explicit this third natural-supernatural distinction. I'm now going to quote him in full because I don't want to break his lockstep logical sequence. So bear with the long quotation. Those properties of value and meaning that fall outside the coverage of science can inhere in what is immanent and perceptible without being elaborated in anything but secular terms. And if the terms of their description are not sacral or religious terms at all, but are purely secular, a question is raised about what it is that makes them significantly different from the other non-sacralized properties of nature to which we have become so accustomed for some centuries now since the onset of modern science. It is to capture this differential that the third criterion for a distinction is formulated. What makes these properties distinct, even controversial, is they, for some centuries, certainly ever since the middle or late 17th century, fall afoul of a common notion that there is nothing in nature, nothing natural, therefore, that is not countenanced by natural science. Nature contains, and I would say that the recent rise or fetish of neuroscience, which is extending into all kinds of realms previously reserved for art and other such realms, art and religion, is testimony to that. Okay, so let me repeat that sentence. What makes these properties distinct, even controversial, is they, for some centuries, certainly ever since the middle or late 17th century, fall afoul of a common notion that there is nothing in nature, nothing natural, therefore, that is not countenanced by natural science. Nature contains all sorts of properties that natural science studies. The point is that value and meaning are wholly unlike those properties. Value and meaning as properties are precisely what are not countenanced by natural science. Science has nothing to say about them. If so, these properties are supernatural by this third criterion. But being immanent and perceptible, they are perfectly natural by the terms of the second distinction. That is why natural supernaturalism is one prima facie startling, but perfectly accurate description of them. And once we disambiguate the terms natural and supernatural by these three distinct criteria, there is nothing startling either. I have said that values and meanings as inhering in the world, including nature, are made possible by the second criterion of the natural as that which is immanent and perceptible. And I have also said that though in an earlier time, value and meaning as properties of the world would have necessarily been elaborated in some form of religious or sacral terms, in much romantic poetry and thought, though not by any means all, that is simply not so. And Abrams' readings and expositions display that at length. So these properties can be natural by the first criterion of the natural as well. If so, why is the third criterion of the natural needed at all? And in a crucial move in my sorting out of these ambiguities, I said it is needed because we have, since the rise of modern science, which is well before the canonical romantic poetry was produced, thought that nature contained properties so radically unlike the properties of value and meaning, it would be a form of insouciance to think that there was nothing controversial whatever about saying they may sit side by side with these other properties. It is to the extent that we actually do find it controversial that we are motivated to formulate the third criterion of what to count as natural, by the lights of which value and meaning are not properties of nature. And if many have for some considerable time now found it unacceptably controversial, it is because of this pervasive metaphysical outlook of scientific modernity that even preceded Romanticism in its canonical period. Even so early a figure as Blake's passionate outcry against Newton was an avowedly romantic reaction to that outlook. Unquote. Put in these abstract philosophical terms, the controversy of positing value properties of nature alongside the properties of nature science studies might not be striking. But the example Belgrami then uses to ground these abstractions renders the controversy very striking. He uses the example of a natural threat versus a meteorological phenomenon. The threat is a value property of nature, immeasurable by science, whereas the meteorological phenomenon is a property science can measure. Can both properties exist side by side? The scientistic outlook to which Blake and the Romantics objected would deny that there is any such thing as a threat intrinsic to nature. The orthodox thinking runs as follows, quote, "No, values and meanings are not perceptible properties of the natural world. They're really products of our mental capacities and dispositions, what philosophers such as Hume and Adam Smith call desires and moral sentiments, which by an act of our own mental projection, we then attribute to the perceptible world. So to call something out there in the visible distance on the horizon a threat is not to describe something out there that no natural science could possibly study. There is nothing out there that is not countenanced by natural science. Thus, to call it a threat is only to project something constructed from our own feelings of vulnerability onto the world. How can threats exist outside us, just like and on par with meteorological phenomena? Meteorological phenomena are there anyway, whether we apprehend them or not, but threats wouldn't be threats if they weren't threats for us. They are not there anyway, so are not really independent of us. They are projections of our own mentalities and psychologies." That's unquote. That was the rehearsal, Belgrami rehearsing the orthodox view. And so we are now often running with the outlook that Blake decried, where there is nothing in nature that is not studied by natural science. No enchantment, however secular and non-sacral, in the world, unquote. The ventriloquized rationale above is so familiar to us that we can now see just how controversial it is to say that values, such as threats, in nature itself exist alongside those values that science studies. Belgrami goes on ventriloquizing orthodox. Belgrami goes on ventriloquizing the orthodox view. Quote, at best we are enchanted with our mentalities and our imagination. The rest of nature is brute and valueless, only metaphorically spoken of, by us as enchanted in a sustained and comprehensive fit of projective vocabulary of threats and other such evaluatively loaded terms. Hence, there is more than one kind of supernaturalism, not just the one about God, whether transcendent or immanent, but one about value too. We apparently then don't just suffer from a God delusion, we suffer from a value delusion as well. The latter needs exorcism just as much as the former, unquote. This is precisely the early modern picture of value and agency enshrined in the doctrine of naturalism simpliciter, the very picture that extended the scientific purview into every arena, including the aesthetic, hence the rise of the novel. And this is precisely the disenchanted picture that Blake and his younger colleagues resisted with the metaphysics of natural supernaturalism. In sum, the very old idea that words, images, objects, and things in the world, including in nature, are value and meaning laden, an idea that had been religiously expressed in the past and could now be secularly expressed, becomes controversial only after the rise of science. Hence Blake's outcry against Newton, or rather Newton, the official Newton who acquiesced to the ideologues of the Royal Society. It is that controversy that renders such an old and axiomatic idea a resistance. In purveying a metaphysics of natural supernaturalism, the Romantics revived the heterodoxy, the radical sectaries and scientific dissenters that lost to the orthodoxy a century and a half earlier. And that resistant line continues into the present. If Blake was so dead set against the metaphysical doctrine of naturalism simpliciter, it is because he keenly grasped its stakes in all the important arenas of modern life: ethics, politics, moral psychology, and even aesthetics. Naturalism simpliciter led to the disenchanted ethical framework of immanent frame, exclusive humanism, and buffered selfhood, a political economy encompassing capitalism, colonialism, slavery, cognitive elitism, including especially a centralized state, but also experts in the form of lawyers and doctors, and politesse, a moral psychology of widespread alienation, and a new aesthetic form modeled on science, the realist novel. Against all of this, Blake and his heirs posited a metaphysics of natural supernaturalism, a mainly secular, re-enchanted ethical framework of a value-infused immanent sphere, non-exclusive humanism, and unbuffered selfhood. A revolutionary politics that would overturn the orthodox Enlightenment institutions mentioned just above, psychology of unalienation, and a poetry that would re-enchant the world. How would or could poetry re-enchant the world? After the excesses of the French Revolution, in which they had put so much faith, the Romantics shifted their emphasis from political revolution to revolution in human consciousness. It was their conviction that such cognitive revolution, in which poetry would play the key role, would, quote, turn the world upside down in the most lasting and meaningful ways. Political revolution was deeply connected to an enchanted ethics, which in turn hinged on a particular philosophy of nature. Blake's revolutionary anthem, Everything That Lives Is Holy, demanded the overthrow of tyrannies, not just political, but also mental tyranny. He constantly analogized gender, race, and mind, suggesting that the orthodox Enlightenment philosophy of nature that constrained the mind from seeing nature's value properties was the same philosophy that supported and enabled colonialism, slavery, and patriarchy. Visions of the Daughters of Albion makes it clear that Blake saw, quote, that the immediate issues of rape, slavery, and exploitation have roots as deep as the mind itself, unquote. That's Essick, the commentator. He intuitively understood the connection between disenchanted metaphysics and modern societal institutions, ethics, and practices that Bilgrami laid out in the careful philosophical arguments, which I just rehearsed. The fate of all three cognates, gender, race, and mind, hung in the balance of oppression and liberation. Because a particular philosophy of nature engenders a particular politics, a revolution in vision was needed before a revolution in relations could take place. Romantics like Schelling earnestly believe that a revolution of knowledge, quote, will not be restricted in its influence to philosophy proper, but will transform the conditions of human life and action, unquote. That was Abrams. Poetry would play the privileged role in this revolution in vision, in this re-enchantment of the world, because it normatively repudiated the doctrine of naturalism simpliciter that was promoted by the notorious they of Blake's visions. The Orthodox Enlightenment triumvirate, Bacon, Newton, and Locke. Elsewhere in Blake's mythography figured as body and mind enslaving Urizen, the very same mind enslaving doctrine that underpinned the realist novel as wrought by the likes of Defoe. Contra realism, poetry would re-enchant the world by relishing a polyvalence of images and a rich metaphoricity, always reaching up to the spiritual, like the world itself by their lights. As such, poetry could serve as the refuge for the ancient enchantment that had been chased away by the modern regimes of disenchantment, just as Schiller envisioned it. Blake especially drew from these older enchanted traditions of poetry, epic, and myth, cobbling together an idiosyncratic visionary mythography out of ancient Greek, Celtic, Hebrew, and other sources. Notably, there is also a strong Dionysiac emphasis to his works. For example, in Visions, the daughters of Albion function as the Greek chorus, and Othune is depicted as a sort of Prometheus figure. Just wanted to make that little connection with Nietzsche. In reaction to Enlightenment's, quote, rationalism and decorum, unquote, Romanticism, according to Abrams, quote, reverted to the stark drama and supra-rational mysteries of Christian stories, unquote. Indeed, short of Bilgrami's third register of his titular natural supernaturalism, Abrams seems to have understood the term primarily as a displaced and reconstituted theology or secularized form of devotional experience at the heart of Romantic philosophy and literature, particularly in the British and German traditions. In other words, a new mythos, a metaphysical inheritance from religion fitted to secular society. This new mythos was, without doubt, elaborated most elaborately by Blake and sought to militate against the metaphysics of naturalism, supernaturalism, not only at the level of form, but also content. At the level of form, Blake's stark drama and supra-rational mystery couldn't be further from the realist novel underpinned by naturalism simpliciter. As Edward Said says, one can think of Blake and Defoe as the poles of English literature. But Blake doesn't stop at form. Arguably, the central drama of his oeuvre is the contest between the metaphysical doctrines of naturalism simpliciter and natural supernaturalism, with the respective principles assigned to composite archetypal dramatic personae and kingdoms. Let us take the aforementioned Urizen, for example. Abrams writes, the mastery of Urizen, the isolated and self-centered reason, representing the stance of the natural scientist, is correlative with a drastic change in human perception, a shrinking of, quote, all the vast of nature before their shrunken eyes, and a binding of men, quote, more and more to earth, closing and restraining, unquote, to the point at which man's submission to the philosophy of five senses, quote unquote, was complete. The reintegration and harmonious ordering of the mental faculties, as we know, marks the liberation of that freely expansive or multiple vision which delivers to human consciousness a new world, which is the free state of mind that Blake calls the New Jerusalem. And that was Abrams quoting Blake. This mythologized critique of the despotism of the eye over the mind is a direct critique of naturalism simpliciter. The notion of nature is nothing more than that which can be observed and studied by science. It's important to note that Blake's notion of mind has nothing to do with the cogito, quite the opposite, in fact. He means mind in its visionary, imaginative, spiritually perceptive aspect. The ethical upshot of this metaphysics is everywhere borne out in Blake's poetry. Taking just visions alone, quote, cold floods of abstraction, unquote, are connected to solitude, alienation, buffered selfhood. Here you can think of the figure Theotormen. The instrumental relation to others, here think of Bromian, whose most exploitative and pernicious forms are colonialism And anticipating Marx, the reduction of labor to capital, and anticipating Freud, the perversion of natural sex drive into violence in the political and economic spheres. As well, by making the connection between Bromian's wish to have impregnated Othun through his rape of her and his branding of New World African slaves, Blake shows the imperative relationship between feminism and anti-colonialism, a relationship lost on even so brilliant and liberal a person as Charlotte Bronte a century later. Abrams writes, quote, "A striking phenomenon in literary history is the degree to which English writers, collaterally with their German contemporaries, imported such societal terms as conflict, mastery, tyranny, submission, slavery, equality, and freedom into the cognitive realm to represent the relations between the mind and the natural world, or between the mind and the physical senses in the act of perception." Unquote. This tight link between the mind-nature relation and human relations empowered the Romantics, who felt they could, through their words on the page, transform the former so as to transform the latter. If, quote, "fragmented vision yields a fragmented humanity," unquote, that's Abrams quoting Gleckner, then an integrative, expansive vision whereby, quote, "all the environing world, which in its divorce from man had seemed stony, dead, and alien, reveals itself to be alive and human," unquote, could restore the world to its unity. So let me just condense that sentence. If fragmented vision yields a fragmented humanity, then an integrative, expansive vision could restore the world to its unity. Okay, next section. The critique of nostalgia. Viewed in the long Romantic context, even Nietzsche's philological excavation of ancient Greece and the birth of tragedy appears neither atavistic nor nostalgic, as is so often thought. He is modeling the genealogical approach pioneered by himself and followed by Bill Brahmi, Israel, Jaeger, etc. Quote, "a reading practice that looks simultaneously forward and backward, that recommends we return to an earlier moment in order to see how its dissenters or losers might have anticipated us," quote, that's Jaeger. This is not the superficial ostriching reactionary throwback suggested by the term atavism. Rather, it is a rigorous radical revision of history. We recognize ourselves and our aspirations in those who did not prevail in the past. We link ourselves to them and draw upon their resources and translate them into a modern idiom, or identify them in nascent modern forms in order to target the Newtonian orthodoxy and its legacies. When the struggle is ongoing, nostalgia is moot. Unfortunately, the ongoing nature of that struggle is not always apparent, even to its effortful protagonists. The conceptions about so-called modernity advanced by the Orthodox Enlightenment narrative have become so axiomatic that the counter-tradition has not easily been able to identify itself as such. Only recently, since the mushrooming of disenchantment or secularism discourse, have scholars like Bill Brahmi and Jaeger and myself tried to sketch out this tradition as capaciously and clearly as possible. It is still very much a collective work in progress. Standard notions of rationality, progress, and Orientalism have stood as obstacles between those who ought to be mutual participants in the counter-tradition. The embarrassment of my own field, postcolonial studies, to make some of the affiliations that I'm making is the result of its subscription, tacit or explicit, to some of these standard notions. Edward Thompson famously described the modern consciousness toward the past as, quote, the enormous condescension of posterity, unquote. We need to cure ourselves of the bias towards the so-called modern, particularly when the axiomatics that have upheld it have been exposed as spurious. One of these, of course, the conception of rationality, which in the thin sense of the term ought to mean nothing more than an able-minded adult's capacity to think logically, or less minimally defined, it ought to mean nothing more than addressing scientific questions with scientific evidence. However, rationality in the thick sense of the term means something entirely other, something entirely ethical. It has come to mean espousing the ethical framework of the disenchanted or secular age, immanent frame, exclusive humanism, buffered selfhood. In an intellectual moment when alternative modernities have been explored to provincialize Europe/the West, it seems important to be consistent, to understand that modernity need not be mutually exclusive with modes that have been lost in Europe, but not necessarily elsewhere or everywhere. There is tremendous cultural bias, not to say perversity, given the assessment of damages, in requiring disenchantment as a prerequisite to be considered modern. This bias underpins even the secular post-colonial position that balks at any suggestion that the non-West present resembles the West past, an ironic position in the sense that it repudiates developmental logic at the same time that it assumes it, to wit, by privileging present over past. The goal of Taylor's and Bilgrami's debunking of the commonplace subtraction stories about modernity is precisely to expose the spuriousness of the teleological/developmental logic invoked on behalf of Western modernity. Ironically, that logic underpins both the colonial ideology that deemed the West superior to the non-West and the post-colonial repudiation of that ideology. It is particularly important to overcome that developmental bias when it comes to understanding the colonial context and indigenous resurgence movements that have, to a significant degree, deliberately preserved an enchanted worldview. As Gandhi exhorted India most consequentially in his 1909 Hind Swaraj manifesto that mobilized the mass movement for independence, there are other ways than the orthodox West for doing modern. It need not require abandoning certain traditions, i.e. enchantment, that had proven salutary for India and the loss of which had proven deleterious to Europe. Studying Europe, Gandhi asked a fundamental question, quote, when and how did we transform our concept of the world as not merely a place to live in, but a place to master and control? He understood that this question was connected to other concerns. He was wary of cognitive elitism, regimes of expertise that converted people into reified populations to be studied in a detached way rather than simply engaged as fellow people. He was also skeptical of the notion, basic to European modernity, that human beings are made better by being made into some abstract new form of being called citizens. He saw all of these transformations of European modernity as non-compulsory for India. They had led to widespread alienation in Europe that he wanted to avoid for his own country. The same could be said of the Haitian Revolution that identified more with Macandal and Boukman, the apotheosized voodoo Hungans that led the initial phase of the revolution, than with Toussaint Louverture, the European-styled military genius that led the later phase. The difference between Europe's early modern metamorphosis and India's decolonizing metamorphosis is that the latter had in hindsight and with it the potential to construct in a deliberate manner. Of course, there's much to discuss about how that all went by our vantage point. Colin Yeager describes the genealogical approach as looking backward and forward. To those directions, I would like to add outward. Looking across from India to the West, from the West to India, has been and can only be salutary. Re-enchanting developments have been afoot in the West, in philosophy, art, ecological, and other activism. In philosophy, Jane Bennett, Nicholas Compridis, Bruno Latour, and Nikhil Bilgrami re-theorize agency and value toward unalienating us from nature/world. Likewise, in art, such as my friends Robert and Shanna Park Harrison's ecologically oriented magical realist art, which according to the artist is meant to elicit a viscerality of response, shifts the emphasis away from the conceptual, the cognitive, the buffered mind. In activism, the deep ecology movement has gained great momentum with proponents like the anti-capitalist Naomi Klein, etc. But aside from the occasional passing reference to First Nations, these developments seem to be happening rather independently of the sustained enchantment in many non-Western sites. For example, Klein is to a large extent reinventing the wheel. Her 2014 manifesto is a more superficial, less integrated version of Gandhi's from a century ago. Given how dedicated, daring, intelligent, savvy, and influential Klein is, she could learn much from Gandhi and take forward his Indian legacy in potentially world-altering ways. My view is that when it comes to disenchantment, the West can no longer afford to ignore the non-West. For its own self-assessment and self-reconstruction, the West discussions cannot remain as culturally insular as they've been. It's time to attend to alternative worldviews, to learn from them, to make connections and affiliations. This is beginning to happen. And it has been my greatest challenge, purpose, and gratification to have spent these past many years forging such connections and drawing necessary distinctions, extending the radical Enlightenment tradition into cultural, political, and aesthetic realms that had not been considered at peace with it. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience. And now I can take questions for about half an hour.
Thank you, ma'am. It's now time to move on to the question and answer session. I would be reading out the questions posted in the chat box. So participants are encouraged to come up with your questions, which would be answered by our speaker. Ma'am, the first question is from Girish C. Do the counter narratives of enlightenment, when reading together theoretically against the teleological modern sensibilities, generate a totality of neo-humanistic ideologies?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that. I'm going to look.
Repeat it.
I see in the chat box to the counter narrative. I would ask Girish, what do you mean by neo-humanistic? I want to make sure I understand that term before I respond. Is Girish there to clarify? Hello?
Ma'am, participants cannot use their mic. They are muted.
I think he is typing it out. We'll just wait.
Okay. Oh, have I muted him?
The participants are muted by default.
Ah. Okay, I'm not sure what exactly is happening. Should I answer to the best of my ability, Thomas, or should I wait? Oh, I see. I mean, new forms of, yes, I think so. So again, to summarize Girish's question, he had asked whether these counter narratives of enlightenment, when read together against the teleological modern sensibility, can generate a kind of a new forms of humanistic sensibilities. Absolutely. I want to be clear that in any of the narratives and the grander meta narrative that I was trying to synthesize here, I would not call, none of them are anti-humanist. I mean, I know there's some debate about Nietzsche and whether he's an anti-humanist or not, but for the purposes, for considering his work within the tradition I just sketched out, the radical enlightenment or counter-enlightenment tradition, I would say that they're all humanist, but again, not exclusive humanist. So it's a humanism that includes that which lies beyond human flourishing. And in fact, human flourishing is often understood to necessitate the flourishing of that which lies beyond humans, whether that's nature or in a more kind of religiously rich context, divinity of some form or divinities of some form. So thank you. I hope that it's a pithy response. So yeah, the kind of anti-humanism of the mid-century existentialists and onward, while critical of the project of enlightenment, are coming from it, I think, from a very, very different perspective. And I would say in some ways are even more disenchanted than the Orthodox Enlightenment disenchanted champions. Okay, maybe I can take another question now.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, shall we move on to the next question?
Please.
Okay. The question is from Rafiz Chanathan. The question is, can we theorize the recent researches and interest in the philosophy of Levinas as a counter movement to deconstruction? Can we think about counter deconstruction or counter existentialism in a relatable manner?
I think so. I mean, I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse as I'm not a philosopher. I have to show my cards. I'm a literary critic with an interest in philosophy. And so I come to this discourse from the literary, critical, and theoretical angle. So though no expert in Levinas, I would say that, yes, I mean, I think the interest in a kind of relationally robust ethics, which we see in these, you know, in the sort of turn towards Levinas on friendship, and also with Jane Bennett talking about vibrant matter and really trying to understand ourselves in a more reciprocal and responsive relation to other elements of the world, even beyond other humans. I consider, yeah, I think of all of this as sort of counter existential, counter deconstructionist, at the same time that it's counter enlightenment. So there's a kind of trajectory that's being critiqued from Orthodox Enlightenment, let's just call it Newtonianism, all the way through existentialism and the more rigorous forms of anti-humanist deconstruction. That's a kind of counterpoint to this line that I think starts with the Levels and Diggers and Quakers and other radical sectaries of about a half century prior to the scientific dissenters within the Royal Society, going through to the Romantics, to the Nietzsche of Birth of Tragedy, to modernists like the Collège de Sociologie with Bataille and Léris, even T.S. Eliot to a certain degree, though he's a bit compromised in his enchantment, all the way through to our current moment with this kind of return to romanticism, or a new romanticism, and a new materialism in some ways, although I'm loath to associate what I'm talking about with those triple O guys. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Anurag Bhattacharya. Could you please throw some light on how the evolution of the idea of imagination developed during the Romantic period presented a counter discourse to the theories of enlightenment?
That's a great question. There's so much to say there. And I feel, I mentioned when I was privileging naturalism, supernaturalism as the cornerstone of Romantic philosophy and poetic practice, I said there are other, obviously other competing trademarks or hallmarks of Romanticism that are considered superlative and really special. And of course, one of those, as many people know, is the concept of genius, and the other is imagination. I see imagination as actually the twain of that genius focus and this naturalism, supernaturalism focus. I mean, that the value of the imagination in resisting the orthodox project of enlightenment was, again, that cognitive revolution, that the imagination could be a locus of revolution, even when the world itself was not sort of ready for revolution. And that was the takeaway that the younger Romantics, that was the kind of upshot that the younger Romantics took from the French Revolution, when it had not fulfilled its promise as a revolution in their minds. And of course, we know that the American Revolution, the French Revolution were really valorized and invested in by these young poets. But when, you know, the reign of terror and then the kind of dialectical overturning of the revolution by bourgeois forces happened, these young poets really mobilized the imagination as the new locus for revolution. So the cognitive revolution would then bring about the political revolution. And I do see that trend in that whole long line of counter-Enlightenment thought in Europe specifically. And here I want to really make a distinction, because actual, you know, sort of out there enchantment had been superseded by the collective public outlook of disenchantment and the actual systems and institutions of disenchantment. The emphasis is often prescriptive in this counter-Enlightenment tradition, meaning the idea is that you re-enchant, you bring about the world that you want. You turn the world upside down by starting with the mind itself, by cultivating a different sort of cognition. And I didn't speak much about this, but even in Bilgrami's kind of re-enchantment scheme, which is a very modest re-enchantment scheme, it has none of the grandiosity and mythic richness of a Blake. But nevertheless, what he's suggesting is that we use our quotidian enactments and relations of enchantment, that we actually do respond to the world often in an unnoticed but reciprocal, responsive way, where we actually do indeed see, you know, threat out there or value out there in nature, but we aren't reconciled to that other frame in which we operate publicly, whereby we're not really supposed to think that way. And so Bilgrami's view is to kind of dissolve the barrier between those two frames and use our quotidian, modest, enchanted practices, sort of lowercase e, to criticize the capital D disenchanted outlook that has been kind of enshrined in public discourse for 400 years, you know, the way we're supposed to think about nature and political economy. But all of that, again, from the Romantics all the way to Bilgrami's soft-pedaled version of re-enchantment, or even Taylor's, which, you know, is more punctuated. He thinks of fullness as one of those, as a momentary resistance to the otherwise pervasive secular or disenchanted outlook. All of these posit, you know, the strength of re-enchantment in the imagination, in the perception, in the way that we see the world. So that if you see it as enchanted, essentially, you can actually, you know, gradually make the public structures and collective look enchanted. And I do credit the Romantics with kind of inaugurating that that valorization of the imaginative, as, you know, and really seeing power in cognitive revolution. That's what makes the work that Colin Yeager and all these philosophical romantics are doing right now so exciting, because it makes possible what we do as philosophers or as poets or whatever it may be. It makes it actionable, I suppose. You know, the idea is that this work will actually have consequence in the world, in policy, in activist interventions, grassroots interventions, in the way we understand our ethical relations that might inform political and ideological commitments. I think I'll stop there. Rather wordy.
Thank you, ma'am. Shall we move on to the next question?
Sure.
Okay. The question has raised by Professor Josie Joseph. And the question is, Foucault, in his famous text on Nietzsche's genealogy, makes a striking statement that knowledge is not made for understanding, it is made for cutting. How do you understand this? How would you relate it to the ethical and ideological implications it entails for the academia?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for it. And I mean, I'm thinking about Nietzsche's philosophy as a hammer comment in that same vein. I mean, I find Nietzsche's aphorisms to be always wonderfully generative. There are lots of ways to think about them. I think in the context of today's discussion, I really do feel, yes, philosophy in this case, and from the beginning, from the Romantics onward. And yeah, I include Nietzsche, even though of course he had his own reservations about Romanticism, qua Romanticism as a movement, but his commitments align with them to a large degree. And in that sense, you know, philosophy was not understood to be some rarefied activity that takes place in some locus removed from society, or removed from nature, but rather exists on behalf of and towards intervention in the world. And so I think that's why for Nietzsche, there's so much not only down to earthery in his aphorisms, for example, in The Gay Science, but even in his earliest work, Birth of Tragedy, there's so much sensoria in his philosophy. You know, there's a real materiality to the thought, and nothing remains abstruse. It's philosophy that can be understood in terms of you're very moving through the world. And it's really not on behalf of il cogito. So the embodied nature of knowledge, its interventionist possibilities, its revolutionary possibilities, and its non-elitist possibilities, I think are there in this philosophical tradition from beginning to end, you know, and you really see that with Wordsworth, who's of course a poet and not a philosopher, but in his valorization of everyday life and the everyday man, you know, the things of this world actually communicating the philosophy by which to live. I was really struck by Yeats's introduction to Tagore's Gitanjali, in which I don't remember if he actually cites Nietzsche's philosophy of the hammer, but what he's moved by, Yeats, in Tagore's Gitanjali is the viscerality of those poems, the non-disembedding, the non-excarnation of the body and the material world, the sensual, phenomenal aspects of the world that themselves produce a philosophy. So it's as if philosophy comes out of the ontology of the world rather than sort of looks down upon and theorizes it from afar. So I think there are quite a lot of ethical and ideological implications there, which we're seeing borne out even in the work of a Bruno Latour with his assemblages and Jane Bennett, who in their way are trying to make paratactical, I think, for better or for worse, they're trying to make paratactical humans' relations with all that is non-human in our sphere, in our world, and actually understanding those assemblages as a sort of philosophy.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Muthukumar M. Does the counter narrative of enlightenment want to subtract scienticism as enlightenment did with religion, or does it want to bring the spiritual or religious elements to coexist with science?
Wow, thank you for that question. I love that question. And I'm so glad you asked it, because I was sort of using this shorthand of scientism throughout the talk and wished I could have dwelt a little bit longer on what I meant by scientism and what the difference is between scientism and science. So, I mean, just to answer your question very quickly and reductively, and then I'll try to nuance it a bit. Yes, I think it does wish to bring the spiritual religious elements in coexistence with science. in other words, to have the third and the first personal point of view coexist, or to use that long elaboration and example by Bill Gramy to have the threat and the meteorological phenomenon exist side by side. That those are two valid ways of knowing the world, even if they're in any one given moment, mutually exclusive. It's either a duck fact or a rabbit fact. And there is no reason that the one needs to supervene the other. And I think that supervenience is what scientism is. And that's the kind of enlightenment bias that science has the purchase on the truth of the world, on the nature of reality, on the nature of nature. And to that extent, it sort of exceeded its boundaries and moved into realms of value that would otherwise have been able to establish an alternate way of seeing or knowing that reality. And so I think the counter narrative is not suggesting that we do away with science, and actually is not even really challenging the groundwork of science, because science qua science, which is not the same thing as scientism, an ideology that privileges and prioritizes the scientific view on the world. That's actually a metaphysical view, not a scientific tenet, is not scientific or unscientific. It just exists in a different realm, right? That which science cannot study, the realm of value, the realm of the realm that addresses the evaluative properties of the world. And so even someone like Tagore or Gandhi, when he was in a less rather than more tendentious mood, didn't necessarily have beef, especially, I'm going to leave Tagore out for the moment because he was quite bullish on science, but even Gandhi was not anti-science. He was anti-overreach of science. And he was against the ways in which some of its forms, some of its technologies were impacting society. So I guess to put it simply, these figures that recently, Dawkins and Dennett and other sort of neo-Cold Warriors are positing science against religion, are positing a false dichotomy according to this tradition, which would allow for the realm of science to address the realm of science, which is, based on certain protocols of measurement and evidence, while leaving aside all that is not in its purview. And I think at this point, there's really there's no necessity to choose the one or the other, but getting clear about that takes a little bit of patience and tolerance, which you can see absent in some of the more, again, tendentious moments of writing by Adorno and Horkheimer, by Nietzsche. They can at times seem very hostile towards a kind of modulated science even. But overall, I would say that, there's value in keeping the science, much like I feel there's value in keeping the word enlightenment. My preference often is for radical enlightenment rather than counter enlightenment, because it seems to me a pity to allow the orthodoxy to hijack enlightenment as a term. There's nothing irrational about the doctrine, the metaphysical doctrine of naturalism, natural supernaturalism, for example. It's only irrational by the ethical lights of Orthodox enlightenment, of the early modern philosophers. And so why give that word up? Sort of why forego rationality rather than simply redefine it or make clear that the thick rationality is being passed off as thin by these sort of cold warriors. Thank you. I'm having trouble hearing.
Oh, no, ma'am, you're clear. Wait. So thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Sarjan. Does W.B. Yeats continue with Blakean ideas on the imaginative reality?
I'm always looking for the question in the side here, as it helps me to see. Can you tell me the name of the questioner again?
Sarjan.
Okay, I don't see it, but anyway, so does Yeats extend Blake's idea of the imaginative, what is it?
Reality.
I think he's partial to it. I mean, I see Yeats as very much part of this trajectory. I didn't focus too much on modernists, and of course, he's a hinge figure, fin de siècle figure. But I would say that yes and no, only because I'm thinking about his his work in the West, but also his work on behalf of Tagore in Tagore's foray in Europe in the teen years in the 1900s. And I would say that I know he was a huge fan. I mean, Yeats loved Blake and loved that Blake was able to resurrect for Europeans a robust sense of spirituality that Christianity hadn't been able to. He saw Christianity as a kind of monotheistic scourge, that that there was no way, that there was a good reason why Europeans were tending towards atheism, particularly Europeans of his milieu, because God was presented as basically punitive, all-knowing, and not needing humans for their love and reciprocal devotion. So for him, Blake presented an alternative spirituality that was very, very attractive. And I think the imaginative dimension of that was important there. But when I see the way that he thinks about Tagore's poetry, there's something there that he really admires in the Bengal that he imagines to be Tagore's Bengal, wherein enchantment doesn't merely exist in the imaginative, in the prescriptive mode, the cognitive, but actually exists in the kind of common cultural backcloth. It's actually there in the world, in the collective outlook, in the view, you say, in the rituals and practices, including, Rabindra Sangeet, and or including the little banis of Kabir. These are commonly shared patrimony of enchantment that in his mind ran up and down society in India. And what he really liked is that religion, again, was sort of in the world. It was materialized, it was collective, it was social, it was artistic, but not in a kind of rarefied way. And so I think where he might part from Blake is simply in the kind of necessary individuation of the imagination. When you imagine, you're by yourself. And even if the goal is to bring that imagination to bear on society so as to make it more integrative, which was certainly Blake's goal, and not just society, but all the elements of the world, of nature and cosmos. Nevertheless, the activity of the Romantic poet is isolated, and Yeats longed for what he felt that Tagore's Bengal had, and that was an actual collectivized, embodied, embedded enchantment.
Thank you, ma'am. Shall we move on to next question?
Please.
Yes. The question is from Arun DM. Is it possible to locate Rousseau and his concept of state of nature within the project of naturalism or supernaturalism?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, the romantics are often criticized, in fact, for, being too enamored, you might say, of the state of nature. They're clearly longing to recuperate that integrated relation between humans and nature. And so I think absolutely that Rousseau was able to propose that state of nature, again, as an alternative to the corrupt ideological and political apparatuses that had grown out of this Orthodox Enlightenment consensus. So, one thing I was thinking about, yes, the state of nature is a kind of ideal type. I think that exists through this long line of counter-Enlightenment thinkers. But I think what I find most interesting about them is that it's not simply a kind of, they're not advocating for a reversion to nature. And even in Blake's mythography, he posits a trajectory whereby humanity goes to this kind of innocent state. You might call it a state of living in a state of nature, completely integrated with nature, but sort of not cognitively sophisticated yet. And then there's the fall, where the rupture happens, and there's disintegration and alienation, and it's horrible. And this is Urizen's moment, you might say. And then the recovery or recuperation that occurs will, in Blake's lights, happen at a higher level. It's going to happen at a more sophisticated level. So there's something dialectical in the way that he imagines moving through those different moments, from state of nature to state of anti-nature or fall from nature, to reintegration, but at a higher level, one that is more cognitively sophisticated, one that understands the stakes. In other words, one that is very self-conscious about human relations, not just with nature and divinity, but with others. Like all of the stuff I was talking about in terms of Blake's establishment of analogies between mind and gender and race and political institutions, all of that is sort of higher level thought, and that's what he was looking forward to, is not simply living in a state of nature, but living in a way that was well integrated with nature, but also politically astute, ideologically healthy, and that would result out of those dialectical turns. All of that said, there's no, I think that the state of nature remains this kind of fetish or sort of touchstone from which society has been lost, and which it can never regain, for that whole line of counter-Enlightenment thinkers. It can never fully regain, and it shouldn't even try. I mean, I think that's the sense, the abiding sense that I get from all these thinkers, including Taylor and Bill Grommy. The goal isn't to recapture the lost innocence, not only because we can't, but because there have actually been some gains through these dialectical shifts since that earlier moment. And we ought to integrate those dialectical gains with what is best of the enchanted worldview. So reenchantment is always looking for, to recover analogs to that original state that's been lost, the kind of innocent enchantment, rather than reverting to the innocent enchantment. Even if, and again, here I hope I don't sound like I'm contradicting myself, even if those earlier modes provide inspiration and cultivate a certain sensibility for those at a later stage of the dialectic. I hope that was satisfactory. Arun, do you feel, shall I speak more or is that okay?
No, ma'am, that's fine. Thank you. Ma'am, our next question is from Professor P.J. Thomas. It goes like, it's so great that you brought in Gandhi to defend the re-enchantment project, but what's your response to the Down with Gandhi movement in South Africa, a colony, also the negligence of Gandhi in our politics and academia?
I'm trying to see the multi-partite question. So I'm trying to find it up here in the chat. Thank you for the question, Thomas. So I missed can you repeat the part about South Africa?
Yes, ma'am, I'll repeat the question. It's so great that you brought in Gandhi to defend the re-enchantment project, but what's your response to the Down with Gandhi movement in South Africa, a colony? Also the negligence of Gandhi in our politics and academia.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I think I've been thinking about Gandhi quite a lot, and I have to say my views about his negligence or non-negligence have actually shifted since last year, I guess when was that? 2018, 19, when all the CAA protests and whatnot were happening in India. At that point, I perceived a kind of retrieval or resurgence of interest in Gandhi's vision, or a sense of the limitations of Nehru's version of secularism. So I took a paragraph out of this already too long lecture where I was saying that it seems like the Nehruvian vision had prevailed in independent India. But my own view, and I'm now leaving aside this kind of interesting moment that was happening in the protests a year and a half ago. But even leaving that aside, Gandhi obviously in Hind Swaraj and in his ideal vision had not wanted India to go the way that it went. But I still don't think that India exactly went the way of Europe 2.0. It's not simply a repetition of Europe's trajectory, which is, I think, why some of that Gandhian spirit was so easily revived, 70 years later in the protests. And so I would say, within academia, I don't totally know. I'm really speaking out of my depth here because I've never actually worked in India. I've spent a considerable time there, but my sense is that Indian academia and academia the world over is an incredibly secular and atheist locus. And because he yoked his political platform to, in a way, a religious one, he was very clear about identifying those elements of Indian traditions and Indian attitudes that he thought worth preserving in the religions of India, not only Hinduism, but obviously his symbolism was mostly Hindu. That creates a problem, for anyone with an allergy towards the political and religious yoking. And the other thing is, always the problem with caste, and the way that he was trying to incorporate Dalits into the Hindu fold. So I think, there are very valid reasons for which Gandhi has not sort of won the day, or did not win the day, both in India and especially within academia. But I think there's so much of value to his vision, which, after all, was not really a re-enchanting one. It was an attempt to sustain enchantment. And you do see many of the the practices and attitudes that he advocated still alive in India, even if at the more abstract level, the political economy took the shape of post-Westphalian Europe. And I would argue, I mean, my book project has to do, the manuscript on the Indian novel has to do with the fact that I think literature has been one of those spaces that have held open enchantment, so sort of kept it sustained, but not only literature, it's literature that's actually reflecting enchantment in the culture at large. And so, you know, the cognitive elite, as Gandhi would have considered academia, is one India. And then there's so much more to India. And what he, you know, his interest, of course, was in ordinary people. So I don't know that there's been a complete negligence of Gandhi. I think that the limits of Nehruvian secularism also have been much discussed even within academia, you know, from Ashish Nandi to Rajiv Bhargava, you know, you've got lots of people discussing the problems of that particular form of political governance in a country that is so vociferously religious. So having a kind of Archimedean attitude towards religion, while honorable, because it allows for all of them theoretically to thrive, in a way misses the substance of the people and their lived commitments. So I don't know. I would say the jury's out. At least I would like for it to be still out on the question of Gandhi. I think I see a resurgence of interest in him the world over. But you know, you all would know much more the status of Gandhi in discourse now in India. And then as for South Africa, again, it's the Gandhi's South African experiment is always both troubling and inspiring. Obviously, it served as the basis for his understanding of how to mobilize politically. It was where he had his first experiment with ashram living. All of that was very valuable, but we know that his original intervention was driven very instrumentally by a concern for his own demographic, that he had a real blind spot towards the oppression of Black people, the majority in South Africa. And, you know, one has to hold the good with the bad, I always feel, with Gandhi, as with most. But I think by the time he got to India, you know, that boat ride to India where he really congealed his ideas, his thinking became much more integrated, much more consistent with itself. And because it's a manifesto, it can be a bit tendentious at times, but I do really think there's a high level of consistency ethically in that work.
Thank you, ma'am. So, ma'am, unfortunately, due to our time constraint, it's time to wind up the question answer session. We had great amount of questions, and don't worry, the questions which were not asked, it would be directly addressed to our speaker. So thank you, ma'am, for your time. So over to Nikhil.
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you, Nina.